I came home from a classified mission and was met with handcuffs. My cheating wife stood there, fake tears, claiming I killed her father. My son took the stand and said, "I saw him do it." The judge asked if I had a final word. I slid a sealed envelope across the table. He opened it and froze. "Lock the doors. No one leaves." You know what they say about homecomings? Yeah, well, they lied. Mine came with a welcoming committee I definitely didn't put on my wish list. 2 cops and a pair of handcuffs that felt colder than a penguin's ass in Antarctica. The metal bit into my wrist before I'd even processed what the hell was happening, which is saying something because my reflexes are usually sharper than a pissed-off porcupine. I'd just stepped through my own front door, for crying out loud. My duffel bag was still hanging off my shoulder like some pathetic olive branch, stuffed with dirty laundry and memories from a mission that officially never happened. You know the kind. The ones where Uncle Sam sends you somewhere that doesn't exist to do things that never occurred. Standard Tuesday for guys like me, except this Tuesday decided to take a hard left turn into Crazy Town. The first thing that hit me wasn't the cuffs, though. It was the smell. My house smelled wrong. Not like the usual blend of old coffee and whatever cheap air freshener Marissa bought in bulk from Costco. This was different, heavier, more deliberate. Like someone had been staging a goddamn Broadway production in my living room while I was gone. Then I saw her, Marissa, my loving wife of 15 years, standing by our staircase like some tragic heroine from a soap opera that got canceled for being too dramatic. And let me tell you, the woman knew how to put on a show. Her mascara was doing that perfect streaky thing. Not too much, not too little, just enough to scream, grieving widow, without looking like a raccoon that got hit by a garbage truck. Her blonde hair was slightly mussed, like she'd been running her fingers through it in distress, but I could tell she'd practiced the look in our bathroom mirror. I'd lived with this woman long enough to know the difference between genuine tears and the kind you order from the catalog of convenient emotions. The cops flanking me were your typical small-town variety. One looked like he spent more time at Dunkin' Donuts than the gym. The other had that eager rookie energy that screamed, "I watched too much CSI." Neither of them seemed particularly comfortable with whatever script they'd been handed. But hey, a paycheck's a paycheck, right? "Ma'am," the chunky one said, his voice carrying that forced gentleness cops use when they're trying not to spook the witnesses. "Are you ready to make your statement?" Marissa nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that looked suspiciously fresh. No crumpled edges, no makeup stains. Props department really went all out on this production. She took a shaky breath. And damn, even I had to admit the woman had missed her calling as an actress before delivering her lines with the precision of someone who'd been rehearsing. "He killed my father." For words. That's all it took to flip my world upside down like a pancake in the hands of a short-order cook having a nervous breakdown. Not, "I think he killed my father," or "I'm worried he might have hurt my father." Nope. Straight to the point. Delivered with the kind of certainty usually reserved for discussing the weather or the fact that politicians are lying sacks of shit. The rookie cop shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively moving to his notebook like he was about to take down a confession from public enemy number 1. Meanwhile, my brain was doing that thing it does in crisis situations, cataloging details, filing away information, trying to piece together a puzzle when half the pieces were apparently made of pure, concentrated bullshit. Her father, Harold Brennan, a man who'd never liked me from day one, which was fair enough because the feeling was pretty mutual. He thought I wasn't good enough for his princess daughter, and I thought he was a pretentious windbag who collected antique coins and complained about kids these days like he hadn't been young once himself. But kill the guy? Please. I had bigger fish to fry and better ways to spend my limited free time. "Officers," I said, keeping my voice level because losing your shit never helps anything. "I think there's been some kind of mistake here." The chunky cop, his name tag read Patterson, shook his head with the kind of authority that comes from watching too many police procedurals. "No mistake, sir. We have a witness statement and evidence placing you at the scene." Evidence. Now that was interesting. Because the last time I'd seen Harold Brennan alive, he'd been bitching about the neighbor's dog crapping on his precious lawn while I nodded politely and counted the minutes until I could escape back to my own house. That was 3 weeks ago, right before I got called away on my little vacation to nowhere. Marissa was watching me now, and for just a split second, I caught something in her eyes that didn't match the grieving daughter act. It was there and gone so fast I almost missed it, but 15 years of marriage teaches you to read the fine print in your spouse's expressions. What I saw wasn't grief or shock, or even anger. It was calculation. Cold, careful calculation, like she was watching a chess game and waiting to see if I'd make the move she was expecting. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some tragic misunderstanding or a case of wrong place, wrong time. This was orchestrated, planned, executed with the kind of precision I usually reserve for my day job. Someone had painted a target on my back, and they'd done it with enough skill to make it stick. The rookie was reading me my rights now, his voice cracking slightly on the part about remaining silent. Ironic, considering silence had been my specialty for years. Marissa was still dabbing at those perfectly placed tears, playing the role of the devastated daughter who discovered her husband was a monster. The whole scene was so perfectly staged it could have won a fucking Emmy. But here's the thing about guys like me. We're trained to see patterns, to spot the flaws in even the most carefully constructed lies. And this lie, beautiful as it was, had cracks. Small ones, but cracks nonetheless. The way her breathing was too controlled. The way she kept glancing at the door like she was expecting someone else to show up. The way her grip on that tissue never loosened enough to actually use it. As they led me toward the door, my own front door that I'd walked through less than 5 minutes ago as a free man, I made myself a promise. Whatever game Marissa was playing, whatever elaborate setup she'd constructed while I was gone, I was going to figure it out. And when I did, she was going to learn that framing a man who kills people for a living isn't just stupid, it's suicidal. The last thing I saw before they shoved me into the back of their patrol car was Marissa, still standing by that staircase, still clutching her prop tissue, still playing her role to perfection. But her eyes followed me through the window, and in them, I saw something that confirmed my suspicions. She wasn't grieving. She was celebrating. If you think getting handcuffed in your own living room is a kick in the teeth, try having your 12-year-old son throw you under the bus in front of God, country, and 2 cops who probably peaked in high school. That's the kind of pain that makes waterboarding feel like a spa day. They dragged me down to the station faster than you could say Miranda rights. And now here I was, sitting in an interrogation room that looked like it was decorated by someone who thought beige was too exciting. The walls were that special shade of institutional gray that screamed, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And the fluorescent lights buzzed with the enthusiasm of a dying wasp. Real homey atmosphere they had going. Patterson, the chunky cop from my living room, was doing his best impression of a hard-ass detective, which would have been more convincing if he hadn't spilled coffee on his shirt during the drive over. His partner, whose name I'd learned was Officer Martinez, looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on planet Earth. Can't say I blamed the kid. So, Mr. Kane, Patterson said, settling his considerable bulk into a chair that groaned in protest. Want to tell us where you were 3 nights ago between 9 and 11 p.m.? 3 nights ago. Right around the time I was busy not killing Harold Brennan because I was approximately 2,000 miles away, doing things that would remain classified until the heat death of the universe. But since I couldn't exactly hand them my real itinerary without causing an international incident, I went with the standard response. I'd like to call my lawyer. Patterson's face scrunched up like he'd bitten into a lemon that had gone bad sometime during the Clinton administration. Come on now, Kane. If you're innocent, what do you need a lawyer for? Just tell us what happened. The old innocent people don't need lawyers routine. Right up there with if you've got nothing to hide. And trust me, I'm from the government, in the Hall of Fame of bullshit statements. I'd heard this song and dance before, usually right before someone tried to pin a war crime on some poor bastard who'd been following orders. That's when they brought him in. Jordan, my son. My 12-year-old boy who used to think I hung the moon and personally installed all the stars just for his entertainment. The kid who would run to the door every time I came home, even if I'd only been gone to grab milk from the corner store. The same kid who was now walking into this gray hellhole, looking like he'd rather be getting his teeth pulled without anesthesia. He wouldn't look at me, not even a glance. His eyes were fixed on some fascinating spot on the floor, like he'd discovered the secrets of the universe hidden in the scuff marks left by 1,000 other suspects. His usually messy brown hair was combed neat, too neat, like someone had spent time making sure he looked presentable for the cameras. Because of course there were cameras. Can't have a good family destruction without proper documentation. Jordan, Martinez said, his voice gentle in that way cops use when they're talking to kids or crazy people. This is your dad, right? My son, my own flesh and blood, the kid I'd taught to ride a bike and throw a curveball, nodded without lifting his eyes. Just a quick bob of his head, like he was confirming the weather forecast instead of identifying his old man in a murder investigation. And you understand that you don't have to talk to us if you don't want to, Martinez continued. Your mom explained that you wanted to tell us something important. Oh, did she now? How thoughtful of Marissa to help our son decide what he wanted to do. I could practically see her fingerprints all over this whole setup, like she'd been coaching him for weeks. Hell, knowing her, she probably had flashcards made up. Jordan finally spoke, and his voice was so quiet I almost missed it. I saw him do it. For more words. Apparently, the Kane family was going for some kind of record in life-destroying brevity. But these 4 words hit different. When Marissa had said I killed her father, it felt like getting sucker punched by a stranger. When Jordan said he saw me do it, it felt like my own heart had decided to file for divorce and take half my soul in the settlement. Can you tell us what you saw, son? Patterson asked, leaning forward with the kind of fake concern that wouldn't fool a golden retriever. And that's when my boy, the kid who used to tell me everything, from what happened at school to his elaborate theories about why dogs couldn't talk, started reciting a story that sounded like it had been written by someone else and memorized word for word. I was supposed to be sleeping, he said, still staring at that damn floor like it held all the answers to life's mysteries. But I heard voices outside. Loud voices. So I looked out my window, and I saw Dad and Grandpa Harold arguing in Grandpa's driveway. Bullshit. Complete and utter bullshit. 3 nights ago, I was sitting in a safe house in Eastern Europe, eating MREs that tasted like cardboard seasoned with disappointment and wondering why the hell I'd chosen a career that involved so much hurry up and wait. But Jordan kept going, his voice getting steadier as he warmed up to his performance. Dad was really angry. He was yelling about money, I think. And then, Jordan paused, swallowing hard like the words were stuck in his throat. And then he pushed Grandpa Harold, and Grandpa fell down and hit his head on the concrete step. The room went dead quiet except for the buzz of those fluorescent lights and the sound of my world crashing down around my ears like a controlled demolition gone wrong. Martinez was scribbling notes like his life depended on it. Patterson was nodding along like Jordan had just solved world hunger, and I was sitting there wondering how the hell my own son had become such a convincing liar. Because that's what this was, a lie. A carefully constructed, perfectly delivered lie that someone had fed to my 12-year-old boy and convinced him was the truth. The details were too clean, too specific, too perfectly aligned with whatever story they needed to tell. Real memories are messy, full of gaps and uncertainty. This sounded like a movie script. And what did your dad do after Grandpa Harold fell? Martinez asked gently. Jordan's voice got even quieter. He just stood there for a minute. Then he checked to see if anyone was watching. And when he saw me in the window, he put his finger to his lips, like he was telling me to keep it secret. The shush gesture. Classic intimidation move, according to every crime show that had ever been made. Except I'd never made that gesture to Jordan in my life, unless you counted the time I told him to be quiet during a movie because his mom was trying to sleep on the couch. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab my son by the shoulders and shake him until the real memories came loose from whatever bullshit someone had packed into his head. I wanted to tell him that his dad might be a lot of things, absent, secretive, probably not winning any Father of the Year awards. But he wasn't a murderer. At least, not the kind who killed family members in suburban driveways. But I couldn't do any of that. Because the moment I opened my mouth to defend myself, I'd be the angry, violent man trying to intimidate a child witness. The optics were already bad enough without me adding to the performance. So I sat there, watching my son destroy me with words that weren't his own, delivered in a voice that barely sounded like him anymore. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my ribs, not my resolve, but something deeper. Something that had to do with bedtime stories and piggyback rides, and the way he used to look at me like I was Superman and Batman rolled into one incredibly awesome package. That was gone now. Maybe forever. And the worst part? Jordan probably didn't even understand what he was doing. In his mind, He was just telling the nice policeman what Mommy had helped him remember. He had no idea he was putting the final nail in his father's coffin with every carefully rehearsed word. When he finally finished his story, Jordan looked up for just a second. Our eyes met across that shitty gray table, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It wasn't guilt or sadness or even fear. It was nothing, just empty, like he was looking at a stranger. Welcome to the Hilton. If the Hilton was designed by someone who thought concrete and despair made excellent interior design choices. My new accommodations came complete with bars for windows, a toilet that had seen better decades, and the kind of ambience that screamed, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," in 12 different languages. The booking process had been a real treat too. Fingerprints, photos, the whole 9 yards of humiliation served up with a side of bureaucratic indifference. They'd processed me like I was some 2-bit gangster instead of a guy who'd spent the better part of his adult life keeping this country's enemies from doing very bad things to very good people. But hey, apparently none of that mattered when your own family decided to throw you under the bus and back over you a few times for good measure. The holding cell was exactly what you'd expect from a place that prioritized function over comfort, which is to say it had all the charm of a morgue and twice the personality. The walls were that special shade of institutional green that someone, somewhere, had decided was calming. Probably the same genius who thought airplane food was delicious and that waiting at the DMV was efficient. The paint was chipped and scarred from years of hosting guests who weren't exactly thrilled with their accommodations. My cellmate for the evening was a guy who looked like he'd been rode hard and put away wet repeatedly. He was curled up on the bottom bunk, snoring with the enthusiasm of a chainsaw cutting through a redwood. The smell coming off him suggested he'd been marinating in cheap whiskey and poor life choices for the better part of a week. At least he wasn't chatty. I took the top bunk, not because I was being polite, but because sleeping above a drunk stranger was marginally better than sleeping next to one. The mattress felt like it was stuffed with broken dreams and recycled disappointment, but I'd slept on worse. Afghanistan had taught me that comfort was relative, and compared to a foxhole in the middle of a sandstorm, this was practically the Ritz. But sleep? Yeah, that wasn't happening. My brain was doing that thing it does when everything goes sideways, running scenarios, analyzing variables, trying to figure out how the hell I'd ended up in this particular circle of hell. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Marissa, standing in our living room, playing the grieving daughter like she'd been born for the role. Here's the thing about my wife, ex-wife, whatever the hell she was now, she'd never been particularly good at hiding her tells. 15 years of marriage teaches you to read the fine print in someone's expressions, and I'd gotten pretty damn good at spotting when Marissa was running a con. The way she'd bite her lower lip when she was lying about where she'd been. The way she'd touch her earring when she was about to say something she didn't mean. The way she'd look just slightly to the left when she was reciting something she'd memorized instead of remembered. And tonight she'd been hitting all those tells like she was playing them on a fucking piano. The carefully placed tears, the perfectly timed pauses, the way she'd delivered that line about me killing her father. It was all performance. Grade A, Oscar-worthy performance, but performance nonetheless. The question was why? What did she gain from putting me in a cage? Sure, she'd never been thrilled about my job, my long absences, the classified nature of most of my work. She'd made that clear enough over the years with her passive-aggressive comments about normal husbands and real relationships. But framing me for murder? That seemed like overkill, even for someone who thought my idea of a romantic evening involved checking the perimeter and making sure all the locks were secure. Then there was Jordan, my son. My boy who'd looked me in the eye and calmly described watching me commit a crime I'd never committed in a place I'd never been. The kid was 12, not exactly master manipulator material, which meant someone had gotten to him first. Someone had spent time coaching him, feeding him details, making sure his story was airtight. The drunk on the bottom bunk let out a particularly spectacular snore that sounded like a freight train having an argument with a garbage disposal. I stared at the ceiling, counting water stains and trying to piece together the timeline. 3 nights ago, Harold Brennan had died. According to Jordan's testimony, I'd been there, angry about money, pushing the old man around until he took a header into his own front steps. Except 3 nights ago, I'd been approximately 2,000 miles away, sitting in a safe house and watching some very bad people do very bad things to some very important infrastructure. The kind of mission that came with its own paperwork in triplicate and enough classified stamps to wallpaper a small house. But since I couldn't exactly hand over my real alibi without causing an international incident, I was stuck playing defense with nothing but my word and a growing suspicion that someone had orchestrated this whole thing with military precision. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started fitting together in ways I didn't like. Marissa's sudden interest in having Jordan spend more time with her father over the past few months. The way she'd been pushing for me to take that last mission, practically shoving me out the door when the call came. The convenient timing of Harold's death, right when I was guaranteed to be out of the country with no way to verify my whereabouts. This wasn't just betrayal. This was strategy. Long-term, carefully planned strategy that required patience, resources, and a level of cold calculation that I hadn't given my wife credit for. Apparently, I'd been seriously underestimating the woman who couldn't remember to pick up milk from the store, but had somehow managed to construct an airtight frame job that would make the CIA proud. The fluorescent light in the hallway buzzed and flickered like it was having its own existential crisis, casting weird shadows through the bars. Somewhere down the corridor, another guest was having a heated conversation with someone who wasn't there, his voice echoing off the concrete walls like a one-man Greek chorus of crazy. But in the quiet moments between the snoring and the ranting and the buzzing, I found something I hadn't expected: clarity. See, when you've spent enough time in genuinely dangerous situations, the kind where people are actively trying to kill you with automatic weapons and improvised explosives, sitting in a jail cell starts to feel almost peaceful. No incoming fire, no mission parameters to worry about, no innocent civilians to protect. Just time to think. And what I was thinking was that Marissa had made a critical error. She'd treated this like a domestic dispute instead of what it actually was, a war. And in war, the side that gets cocky usually gets dead. She'd played her opening moves beautifully. I had to give her that. The grieving widow act, the manipulated child witness, the carefully constructed timeline that put me at the scene of the crime with motive and opportunity. But every good soldier knows that the battle isn't won in the opening moves. It's won in the long game, in the patience to wait for your enemy to overextend themselves, in the discipline to gather intelligence before making your move. And Marissa had just given me something precious: time. Time to think. Time to plan. Time to figure out exactly how deep this rabbit hole went and who else was dancing to her tune. Because one thing was becoming crystal clear as I lay there listening to my drunk cellmate's symphony of snores. This wasn't just about getting rid of an inconvenient husband. This was bigger than that. More complicated than that. This was about money, power, and the kind of long-term planning that suggested I wasn't dealing with an amateur. Marissa might be a lot of things, but she wasn't a mastermind. Which meant someone else was pulling the strings, someone with the resources and connections to make this whole elaborate setup work. The question was, who? You know what they say about hindsight? It's 2020 and a real son of a bitch. Sitting in that concrete paradise, staring at water stains that looked like abstract art painted by someone having a particularly bad day, my brain decided it was the perfect time for a highlight reel of all the red flags I'd been too stupid or too busy to notice. Thanks, brain. Real helpful timing. The thing about being married to someone for 15 years is that you develop this weird ability to ignore the obvious. It's like relationship camouflage. You get so used to the way things are that you stop seeing the way things actually are. And boy, had I been wearing some industrial strength blinders when it came to my loving wife. Our marriage hadn't just been rotting. It had been decomposing like roadkill in August heat, and I'd been walking around pretending everything smelled like roses. The signs were all there, flashing like neon lights at a strip club, but apparently I'd been too focused on keeping the world safe for democracy to notice that my own home front was staging a fucking coup. It started with the deployments. Not the fact that I had to go. Hell, she knew what she was signing up for when she married a guy whose job description included locations may vary and bring your own body armor. But somewhere along the way, her attitude shifted from supportive wife to resentful prisoner, like I was deliberately choosing to leave her behind instead of following orders that came from people who could make my life very complicated if I decided to play hooky. Other husbands come home for dinner, she'd say. usually while I was trying to decompress from 3 weeks of dodging bullets and eating food that tasted like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually met a human being. Other husbands coach Little League and fix leaky faucets and remember anniversaries. Right. Other husbands. The mythical creatures who apparently lived in some parallel universe where the biggest threat to national security was running out of barbecue sauce at the company picnic. I tried explaining that my job was a little more complicated than selling insurance or managing a target, but that conversation always ended the same way, with Marissa sighing dramatically and me feeling like I'd somehow failed at being human. Then there was the silence thing. Occupational hazard of spending your life in classified situations. You get real good at not talking about your day. Can't exactly come home and chat about the weather when you've been somewhere that officially doesn't exist, doing things that never happened to people who were never there. But to Marissa, my inability to share details felt like rejection. You don't trust me, she'd accuse, which was hilarious because trust had nothing to do with it. It's not that I didn't trust her. It's that the guys who signed my paychecks had some very specific opinions about operational security, and those opinions came with prison sentences attached if you decided to get chatty with your spouse. But the real turning point, the moment I should have known we were headed for disaster, came about 8 months ago. I was supposed to be rotating back from a particularly unpleasant assignment involving some very unfriendly people in a very unfriendly part of the world, but the mission got extended. Last-minute intelligence, high-value target, the kind of opportunity that doesn't come along often. So I called home to let Marissa know I'd be delayed another 2 weeks. She didn't take it well. There was crying, there was yelling, there were accusations about my priorities and my commitment to this family. Standard operating procedure for these kinds of conversations. But then she said something that should have stopped me cold. I can't do this anymore, David. I can't keep pretending this is a normal marriage when you're never here, and when you are here, you might as well be a stranger. At the time, I figured it was just frustration talking. 15 years of military wife life catching up with her all at once. So I did what I always did. I promised things would get better, made some vague noises about requesting more stateside assignments, and went back to work assuming we'd figure it out when I got home. Except when I did get home 2 weeks later, something had changed. Marissa was different, not angry anymore, but distant, polite. Like we were roommates who happened to share a bed and a mortgage. She'd smile when I walked in her room, ask about my flight, make dinner conversation about Jordan's school and the neighbor's new fence. All perfectly normal, perfectly pleasant, perfectly fucking fake. That's when I found the phone. I wasn't snooping, for the record. I was looking for jumper cables in her car because mine had decided to die in the Walmart parking lot like some kind of automotive drama queen. The phone was wedged under the driver's seat, wrapped in a McDonald's napkin like someone had been trying to hide it. Not her regular phone. This was a cheap burner, the kind you pick up at gas stations when you don't want certain conversations showing up on your regular bill. The smart play would have been to confront her right then and there. Ask her what the hell she was doing with a secret phone and who she was talking to that required that level of operational security. But I didn't. Know why? Because I was a coward. Because some part of me already knew the answer, and I wasn't ready to deal with whatever shitstorm would follow. Instead, I did what I do best. I gathered intelligence. Wrote down the number from the last incoming call, ran it through some resources I probably shouldn't have had access to for personal use. The number belonged to Patrick Morrison, registered to an address in the nice part of town where people drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. Patrick Morrison, Marissa's ex-husband, the guy she divorced before we met because he was controlling and obsessed with money and incapable of understanding what real love looked like. At least, that's what she'd told me during those long, romantic conversations we used to have back when she actually seemed happy to see me. Apparently, Patrick had been doing pretty well for himself since the divorce. Real estate development, city council connections, the kind of local influence that came with campaign contributions and country club memberships. The kind of guy who could make problems disappear or create new ones, depending on what served his interests. And he'd been talking to my wife. Late at night. For months. The calls always came when I was deployed, never when I was home. Long conversations, sometimes lasting an hour or more. And judging by the timing, they'd started right around the time Marissa had her little breakdown about our marriage being a sham. I should have confronted her then. Should have laid the evidence on the kitchen table and demanded an explanation. Should have asked her what the hell she thought she was doing, sneaking around with her ex-husband while I was out risking my ass to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. But I didn't, because by then, I'd already started to suspect that the conversation wouldn't go the way I wanted it to. Because some part of me had started to wonder if maybe she had a point about our marriage being broken. Because 15 years of trying to balance classified work with family life had taught me that sometimes the best intelligence is the kind you sit on until you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. So I put the phone back where I found it, finished getting those jumper cables, and went home to have dinner with my wife and son like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just discovered that my marriage had more secrets than a CIA black site. Looking back now, from the luxury of a jail cell that smelled like industrial disinfectant and crushed dreams, I could see the pattern. The late-night headaches that sent Marissa to bed early. The sudden interest in taking Jordan to visit his grandfather more often. The way she'd encourage me to take assignments, practically pushing me out the door when opportunities came up. She'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. And Patrick Morrison, the ex-husband with the money and the connections and the apparent inability to let go of what used to be his, had been helping her every step of the way. The question wasn't whether they'd killed Harold Brennan together. The question was why they'd needed him dead in the first place, and why framing me for it was worth the risk of everything falling apart. But I was starting to get some ideas about that too. And none of them were going to end well for the happy couple. Here's something they don't teach you in marriage counseling. When your wife frames you for murder, it really helps to have friends who know how to make people disappear. Not that I was planning anything dramatic, mind you, but when you've spent 15 years pulling certain people's asses out of various international fires, those people tend to remember the favor. And right about now, I needed all the favors I could get. The thing about guys like me is that we don't make friends the normal way. We don't bond over fantasy football or complain about our lawn mowers over a beer. We make friends by bleeding together, by trusting each other with our lives in situations where trust isn't just important. It's the difference between going home to your family and becoming a statistic in some classified after-action report. I'd saved Tommy Rodriguez's life in Syria when he took shrapnel in a firefight that officially never happened. He'd returned the favor in Afghanistan when my position got overrun and I needed someone to call in air support that would have made the evening news if anyone had been allowed to report on it. Mike Chin owed me for Baghdad. I owed Sarah Martinez for that clusterfuck in Eastern Europe, and we all owed Danny Murphy for pretty much everything because the man was a walking miracle when it came to getting people out of impossible situations. These weren't drinking buddies or weekend golf partners. These were the kind of people who understood that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't exactly legal, and sometimes helping a friend meant operating in the gray areas where official channels feared to tread. The kind of people who'd gotten very good at making problems go away quietly and efficiently, without bothering the bureaucrats who preferred their paperwork to stay clean. So when word got out that David Kane, solid operator, stand-up guy, saved more lives than he'd taken, which was saying something in our line of work, had been arrested for murdering his father-in-law in a suburban driveway, certain people started asking questions. Not the official kind of questions that involve paperwork and congressional oversight. The other kind. The kind that got answered in cash payments to the right people and favors called in from contacts who preferred to remain unnamed. Day 2 of my extended stay at the Gray Bar Hotel, Tommy Rodriguez was having coffee with a communications technician who'd always been flexible about which phone records were and weren't available for civilian law enforcement requests. Funny how these things work out. Seems like Marissa's phone records were suddenly accessible to anyone with the right credentials and a willingness to ask nicely. The conversation went something like this. Hey, you know that Kane case everyone's talking about? His wife's been making a lot of late-night calls to her ex-husband. Like, a suspicious amount of late-night calls. The kind that might make you wonder what they've been discussing at 2 in the morning for the past 8 months. Day 3, Mike Chun was having lunch with a guy who worked security for the company that monitored traffic cameras in the suburbs where Harold Brennan had lived. Amazing how these surveillance systems work. Turns out they keep records of who drives through certain neighborhoods, especially the kind of neighborhoods where city councilmen and real estate developers live. Even more amazing how those records might show Marissa's car making multiple trips to her father's house on the night he died, including one trip that lasted exactly 17 minutes, just long enough to commit a murder and stage a crime scene. Now, I'm not saying these conversations were anything other than friendly chats between professionals who happen to work in related fields. And I'm definitely not saying that any classified resources were used for personal purposes, because that would be highly inappropriate and probably illegal. But it's funny how information has a way of flowing between people who understand the value of mutual assistance. Day 4 brought the most interesting development yet. Sarah Martinez, who'd always had a gift for financial investigations, probably because she'd spent 3 years tracking terrorist funding through shell companies that existed only on paper, had coffee with someone who worked at the bank where Patrick Morrison kept his accounts. Not the accounts he used for his legitimate real estate business, mind you. The other accounts. The ones registered to LLCs with names like Pacific Holdings and Morrison Development Trust. Turns out, Patrick had been very busy in the weeks leading up to Harold's death. Large cash withdrawals, wire transfers to offshore accounts, payments to individuals whose job descriptions were probably best left unexamined. The kind of financial activity that suggested someone was either planning a very expensive vacation or preparing to make some serious problems go away permanently. But the real kicker, the piece of information that made everything click into place like a rifle bolt sliding home, came from Danny Murphy. Danny had always been good at finding things that weren't supposed to be found, which made him invaluable when you needed to locate enemy weapons caches or terrorist safe houses. Turns out, those same skills worked pretty well for tracking domestic financial irregularities. Harold Brennan, it seemed, had been sitting on something more valuable than his antique coin collection and his opinions about kids these days. The old man had been the primary beneficiary of his late wife's life insurance policy, a substantial policy that had been sitting in trust, gathering interest, waiting for him to kick the bucket so it could pass to his only daughter. We're talking serious money here. The kind of money that could fund a very comfortable lifestyle for two people who were tired of dealing with inconvenient husbands and their messy military careers. But here's where it gets interesting. The trust had conditions. Harold couldn't just give the money to Marissa while he was alive. There were tax implications, legal restrictions, the kind of bureaucratic red tape that kept large sums of money tied up until all the proper forms were filed and all the right people had been paid their fees. However, if Harold died under certain circumstances, and if his daughter was his sole heir, and if there were no complications like estranged sons-in-law asking awkward questions about the inheritance, well, let's just say that particular trust fund would become available very quickly, with very few questions asked. So there it was, laid out like a tactical map of enemy positions. Marissa gets Harold out of the way, inherits the money, and lives happily ever after with Patrick Morrison, assuming her inconvenient husband is safely locked away for the murder she committed. Clean, simple, profitable. The kind of plan that looked brilliant on paper and would have worked perfectly if they hadn't made one critical error. They'd underestimated exactly how many people owed David Kane a favor. By day 5, my invisible allies had assembled enough evidence to sink Marissa's little conspiracy like a torpedo hitting an aircraft carrier. Phone records showing the coordination between Marissa and Patrick. Financial records showing Patrick's payments to individuals who specialized in making problems disappear. Surveillance footage showing Marissa's car at the scene during the window when Harold died. Bank records showing large transfers from Patrick's accounts to Marissa's, payments that just happened to coincide with her father's death. It was beautiful work, the kind of comprehensive intelligence operation that would have made the CIA proud. Except this operation was being run by people who didn't have to worry about congressional oversight or public accountability. People who understood that sometimes justice worked better when it operated outside official channels. The best part? None of this evidence would ever be traced back to its sources. These weren't official investigations or legitimate law enforcement activities. This was information that had simply become available through the kind of coincidences that happen when the right people ask the right questions of the right individuals at the right time. My friends weren't just gathering intelligence, though. They were positioning themselves for the endgame. Because when you're dealing with people who think they can frame a decorated soldier for murder and walk away with a fortune in blood money, you don't just expose them. You destroy them. Completely. Permanently. In ways that make sure they never get the chance to try this shit again. And that's exactly what was about to happen. Because Marissa and Patrick were about to learn that some favors come with interest, and the bill was almost due. You want to know what real heartbreak feels like? It's not the dramatic chest-clutching, fall-to-your-knees bullshit they show in the movies. It's quieter than that. More insidious. It's the slow realization that the person you die for has been weaponized against you by someone who understands exactly how to twist a knife in the one place you can't defend. Jordan, my boy. My 12-year-old son who used to think I was invincible, who used to run to the door every time I came home from a deployment like I was returning from some grand adventure instead of places where people tried to kill me for a living. The kid who'd beg me to tell him stories about work stuff, even though I could never give him the details he wanted. He'd settle for sanitized versions where the bad guys always lost and dad always came home safe, because that's what kids need to believe about their fathers. Except now that same kid was sitting in a courtroom, telling perfect strangers that he'd watched me murder his grandfather in cold blood. And the worst part? He believed every word he was saying. I'd seen this kind of manipulation before, in places where people did very bad things to extract information from very unwilling sources. Psychological conditioning, memory implantation, the kind of mental warfare that left victims convinced that black was white and up was down. But seeing it done to enemy combatants was one thing. Seeing it done to your own child by your own wife, that was a special kind of evil that made waterboarding look like a spa treatment. The thing about kids Jordan's age is that their brains are still developing, still figuring out the difference between memory and imagination, between what really happened and what they've been told happened. It's why eyewitness testimony from children is usually worthless in court, not because kids lie, but because they're incredibly susceptible to suggestion. Tell them something happened often enough, with enough detail and conviction, and their brains will helpfully fill in the gaps until they have a complete, vivid memory of an event that never occurred. Marissa knew this. Hell, she'd probably researched it, maybe even consulted with professionals who specialized in this kind of psychological manipulation. Because what she'd done to Jordan wasn't amateur hour. This was sophisticated, methodical, and absolutely fucking ruthless. I could see the timeline now, playing out in my head like a tactical briefing. She'd started months ago, probably right around the time she'd reconnected with Patrick Morrison. Little comments here and there about how Daddy seemed different when he came home from work. How he looked angry sometimes, violent even. How maybe Jordan should be careful around Daddy because people who did the kind of work Daddy did sometimes brought that violence home with them. Plant the seeds first. Make the kid start questioning what he knew about his father. Create doubt, uncertainty, fear. Then build on that foundation with more specific suggestions. Remember that time Daddy raised his voice? That wasn't just normal frustration, that was dangerous anger. Remember that time Daddy came home late and looked tired? That wasn't exhaustion from a difficult mission. That was guilt from doing something terrible. By the time she was ready to implant the actual false memory, Jordan's mind had been primed to accept it. His trust in his father had been systematically eroded, replaced with suspicion and fear. And when Mommy sat him down and helped him remember what he'd seen that night, Daddy fighting with Grandpa Harold, Daddy pushing him, Daddy making that shushing gesture to keep Jordan quiet, his brain just accepted it as another piece of evidence that confirmed what he'd already been conditioned to believe. The sick genius of it was that Jordan wasn't lying. In his mind, he really had witnessed his father commit murder. He could describe the scene in perfect detail because his brain had constructed a complete memory based on the suggestions his mother had carefully planted. He could pass any lie detector test, could convince any jury, could look his own father in the eye and swear on his life that what he was saying was true. Because to him, it was true. I thought about all the nights I'd tucked him into bed, all the stories I'd told him, all the times he'd asked me if I was ever scared when I was away. Nah, buddy, I'd always tell him. Good guys don't get scared. We just get careful. And he'd smile and drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that his dad was one of the good guys, that he fought monsters and won every time. Now that same kid thought I was the monster. The psychological damage this would cause him was probably irreversible. Even if the truth came out, even if Marissa's lies were exposed and her conspiracy unraveled, Jordan would spend the rest of his life dealing with the fact that he'd been manipulated into betraying his own father. The guilt, the confusion, the fundamental inability to trust his own memories, it would fuck him up in ways that years of therapy might not be able to fix. And Marissa had done this to him. Not just to me, but to him. Her own son. She'd taken a 12-year-old boy who trusted her completely and turned him into a weapon against his father, knowing full well that the psychological shrapnel would destroy his ability to form healthy relationships for the rest of his life. That's when I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Marissa wasn't just greedy or vindictive or desperate for a new life with her ex-husband. She was genuinely, clinically sociopathic. The kind of person who could sacrifice her own child's mental health without a moment's hesitation if it served her purposes. The kind of person who could look at a 12-year-old boy and see nothing but a tool to be used and discarded. I'd lived with this woman for 15 years. I'd shared a bed with her, trusted her with my life, given her a son. And I'd never seen what she really was underneath the suburban mom facade. Either she was that good at hiding her true nature, or I'd been that blind to the signs. Probably both. The really fucked up part was that Jordan still loved her. Even as she was systematically destroying his relationship with his father, even as she was programming him to become an unwitting accomplice to murder, he still saw her as the person who took care of him, who made his lunches and drove him to soccer practice and kissed his scraped knees. In his mind, she was the good parent, the safe parent, the one who'd never hurt him. Which meant that when the truth finally came out, and it would come out, because my invisible allies were thorough as hell, Jordan would lose both parents at once. He'd realized that his father wasn't a murderer, but he'd also realized that his mother was a manipulative psychopath who'd used him as a weapon. The betrayal would hit him from both sides, and there wouldn't be anyone left for him to trust. I wanted to hate him for what he'd done to me. It would have been easier that way, cleaner. Just write him off as another casualty of Marissa's war against me and move on with whatever was left of my life. But I couldn't do it, because every time I looked at him sitting in that courtroom, pale and scared, and trying so hard to be brave while he destroyed his father with words that weren't his own, all I could see was the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest while I read him stories about knights and dragons. He was a victim too. Maybe the biggest victim of all, because he'd have to live with the consequences of what he'd been made to do long after Marissa and Patrick were just unpleasant memories. The question was whether there'd be anything left of my son to save when this was all over, or whether Marissa had broken him so completely that he'd never be able to trust anyone again, including himself. Either way, she was going to pay for what she'd done to him. That wasn't negotiable. Chapter 7, letting the trap close. You know what separates a good soldier from a great one? Patience. The ability to sit still while everything around you goes to hell. To let your enemies think they're winning while you position yourself for the kill shot. It's the difference between reactive tactics and strategic warfare, between surviving the battle and winning the war. So when they dragged me into that courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit that made me look like a traffic cone with anger management issues, I did something that probably confused the hell out of everyone watching. Absolutely nothing. No dramatic protests of innocence, no desperate attempts to expose the truth, no impassioned speeches about being framed by my vindictive wife. I just sat there, calm as a monk on Xanax, and let Marissa's little theater production play out exactly the way she'd rehearsed it. The courtroom was one of those wood-paneled affairs that was supposed to inspire confidence in the American justice system, but mostly just reminded you that the whole thing was an elaborate performance with costumes and scripts and an audience that pretended to believe what they were seeing. Judge Harrison looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, maybe playing golf or having a colonoscopy, but he was stuck presiding over what everybody assumed was going to be an open and shut case of domestic violence gone wrong. My public defender was a kid fresh out of law school who looked like he'd been told he was defending Jeffrey Dahmer's uglier brother. Every time he glanced at me, his expression screamed, "Please don't eat me," which was both hilarious and depressing. The prosecution had drawn District Attorney Margaret Phelps, a woman who'd built her career on being tougher than a $2 steak and twice as unforgiving. She had the kind of reputation that made defense attorneys wake up in cold sweats and career criminals consider honest employment. But the real show was happening at the plaintiff's table. Marissa had dressed for the part like she was auditioning for the role of grieving daughter in a Lifetime movie about family tragedy. Conservative black dress, minimal makeup that somehow made her look both devastated and dignified, hair pulled back in a way that suggested she was too overwhelmed by grief to worry about vanity. She'd even managed to develop a subtle tremor in her hands that appeared whenever she had to look in my direction. Patrick Morrison sat behind her in the gallery, playing the part of the concerned friend who just happened to be there for moral support. He'd gone for the successful businessman who's definitely not fucking the defendant's wife. Look, expensive suit, tasteful tie, just the right amount of gray at his temples to suggest wisdom and stability. Every so often, he'd lean forward to whisper something comforting in Marissa's ear, and she'd nod gratefully like he was her only anchor in a storm of tragedy and betrayal. Jordan sat beside his mother, looking like he'd rather be getting a root canal from a drunk dentist. The kid had clearly been coached within an inch of his life, sitting up straight, hands folded in his lap, making appropriate eye contact with the jury, but not so much that he seemed rehearsed. Marissa kept a protective hand on his shoulder, the picture of a mother shielding her traumatized child from the monster who'd destroyed their family. It was beautiful work, really. If I hadn't known it was all bullshit, I might have been impressed by the attention to detail. Every gesture, every expression, every carefully timed tear, it all added up to a compelling narrative about a violent husband who'd finally snapped and killed his own father-in-law in a fit of rage. The prosecution's opening statement hit all the right notes. Phelps painted me as a dangerous man trained to kill, someone who'd brought the violence of my military career home with him. She talked about the strain of long deployments, the psychological toll of classified work, the way combat veterans sometimes struggled to readjust to civilian life. It was textbook character assassination, designed to make the jury see me not as a decorated soldier, but as a ticking time bomb who'd finally exploded. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, gesturing toward me like I was a particularly venomous snake. "David Kane is a man who has spent years learning how to kill efficiently and without remorse. A man whose job required him to compartmentalize violence, to separate his emotions from his actions. And when that violence finally came home, when the pressure of maintaining two separate lives became too much, Harold Brennan paid the ultimate price." She called it the warrior's curse, the idea that men like me were fundamentally broken by our experiences, that we were walking time bombs who could snap at any moment and turn our training against innocent civilians. It was insulting as hell, but it was also effective. I could see the jury buying it, see them looking at me with that mixture of fear and disgust that people reserve for rabid animals and politicians. When they called Marissa to the stand, she played her role flawlessly, voice breaking at just the right moments, tears flowing on cue, body language that screamed, victim of domestic abuse. She talked about how I'd changed over the years, how I'd become distant and angry, how she'd started to fear for her safety in Jordan's. "He was different when he came back from his last deployment," she testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that somehow never got too soggy to be effective. "Angrier, more violent. He'd have these episodes where he'd just disappear into himself, like he was back wherever they'd sent him. It was masterful fiction. She took every normal reaction to the stress of classified work, the need for privacy, the difficulty in transitioning between operational mindsets and family life, the occasional moments of distraction when you're processing classified information you can't discuss, and reframed them as signs of psychological instability and potential violence. When they asked her about the night Harold died, her performance reached Oscar-worthy levels. She described getting a panicked phone call from Jordan, rushing over to find her father dead and her husband standing over the body. She talked about the blood, the way I'd looked at her with cold, empty eyes, the threats I'd allegedly made about what would happen if she told anyone what she'd seen. The jury ate it up like free pizza at a college dorm. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, half of them were looking at me like I was personally responsible for every unsolved murder in the tri-state area. Jordan's testimony was even more devastating because it came across as completely innocent. No coaching, no agenda, just a traumatized 12-year-old boy bravely telling the truth about the night his father became a monster. He described the scene with the kind of vivid detail that could only come from genuine memory, because in his mind, that's exactly what it was. The kid even managed to cry at the right moments. Not the forced tears of an adult performer, but the real, heartbreaking sobs of a child who believed he was doing the right thing by telling the truth about his father's crime. It was simultaneously the most convincing testimony I'd ever heard and the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever witnessed. Through it all, I sat perfectly still. Didn't object, didn't react, didn't give them any ammunition to support their narrative about my violent tendencies. My lawyer kept shooting me confused looks, probably wondering why his client wasn't helping with his own defense. The jury kept stealing glances in my direction, looking for signs of the monster they'd been told I was. And Marissa? She kept watching me too, but her expression was different. Cautious, like she couldn't quite figure out why I wasn't playing my part in her drama. She'd expected me to fight back, to rage against the accusations, to give her more evidence of my supposedly violent nature. Instead, she got nothing. Just calm, patient silence from a man who was supposed to be falling apart under the weight of his own guilt. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't just sitting there taking it. I was studying her, cataloging every tell, every micro-expression, every moment when the mask slipped just a fraction. Because while she was busy performing for the jury, she was also revealing things about herself that she probably didn't realize. The way she glanced at Patrick after particularly effective moments in her testimony. The way her breathing changed when she lied versus when she told the truth. The way she unconsciously touched her earring when she was reciting memorized lines versus speaking spontaneously. She thought she was watching me break. Instead, she was showing me exactly how she'd constructed her lies and where the weak points were in her performance. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully planned emotion was giving me intelligence I could use when the time came to destroy her. Because that time was coming. Soon. And when it did, she was going to learn that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. 10 days. That's how long it took for Marissa's little Broadway production to reach its grand finale. And I have to say, she'd put on one hell of a show. The prosecution had paraded witness after witness to the stand. Neighbors who testified about my suspicious behavior, co-workers who described my violent tendencies, even Jordan's soccer coach who swore I'd once looked at him in a threatening manner during a parent-teacher conference. It was like watching a master class in character assassination, each testimony carefully designed to paint me as a dangerous sociopath who'd finally snapped and murdered his own father-in-law in cold blood. The defense my court-appointed lawyer had mounted was about as effective as a screen door on a submarine. Kid meant well, bless his heart, but he was working with nothing. No alibi I could verify without exposing classified operations. No witnesses who could testify to my whereabouts. No evidence that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. Every time he tried to poke holes in their story, they'd patch it up with another witness or another piece of circumstantial evidence that made me look guiltier than a fox in a henhouse full of dead chickens. Judge Harrison had clearly made up his mind somewhere around day 3. You could see it in the way he looked at me, not like a man presumed innocent until proven guilty, but like a rabid dog that needed to be put down for the safety of decent society. His questions to the defense were perfunctory. His rulings consistently favored the prosecution, and his body language screamed that he was just going through the motions until he could slam down his gavel and sentence me to life without parole. The jury was even more obvious. 12 good citizens of this fine community, and every single one of them had bought Marissa's performance hook, line, and sinker. The soccer mom in seat 4 kept shooting me disgusted looks like I'd personally kicked her dog. The retired mechanic in seat 7 actually recoiled when I glanced in his direction. Even the college kid in seat 2, who probably thought he was too cool to be swayed by emotional manipulation, was nodding along with every word of the prosecution's closing argument. And why wouldn't they? The story made perfect sense. Troubled veteran with anger issues finally loses control and kills his wife's father in a domestic dispute gone wrong. Wife and child witnessed the aftermath, traumatized but brave enough to testify against the monster they trusted. It was neat, clean, and emotionally satisfying in the way that real life rarely is. The kind of story that makes people feel good about their ability to spot the bad guys and do the right thing. Marissa had outdone herself during the closing arguments. When the prosecution called her back to the stand for one final statement, she delivered a performance that would have made Meryl Streep weep with envy. Voice trembling with barely controlled emotion, eyes brimming with tears that somehow never quite fell, she looked directly at the jury and spoke from the heart about the man she'd once loved and the monster he'd become. "I keep thinking about the David I married," she said, her voice cracking at exactly the right moment. "The man who used to read bedtime stories to Jordan, who would hold me when I had nightmares, who promised to protect our family no matter what. I keep wondering when that man disappeared and this stranger took his place. She paused, letting that sink in, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture that looked spontaneous, but had probably been practiced in front of a mirror. I know some of you are thinking that I should have seen the signs, that I should have protected my son from his own father. And you're right. I failed Jordan that night. I failed my father. I failed to recognize that the man I'd been sharing a bed with for 15 years was capable of such violence. The tears finally came then, rolling down her cheeks with perfect timing. But I won't fail them again. I won't let fear or misplaced loyalty prevent me from telling the truth about what happened that night. My father is dead because I was too blind to see what David had become, too naive to believe that the man who swore to love and protect our family could be the same man who would murder my father in cold blood. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. Hell, even my own lawyer looked like he was ready to convict me himself. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, the kind of testimony that doesn't just convince a jury of your guilt. It makes them feel good about sending you away for the rest of your natural life. The prosecution's closing argument was almost anticlimactic after Marissa's performance. District Attorney Phelps simply laid out the facts as they'd been presented: motive, opportunity, witness testimony, physical evidence. She reminded the jury that David Cain was a trained killer, a man who'd spent years learning how to take lives efficiently and without remorse. She painted a picture of escalating domestic violence, of a marriage under strain, of a man whose military training had finally turned against innocent civilians. Ladies and gentlemen, she concluded, her voice ringing with righteous authority, the evidence in this case is overwhelming. David Cain murdered Harold Brennan in cold blood, and then he tried to intimidate the only witnesses to his crime, his own wife and son. This is not a case about the difficulties of military service or the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. This is a case about murder, pure and simple. And justice demands that you find the defendant guilty on all charges. My lawyer's closing argument was a valiant effort, considering he was working with roughly the same amount of evidence as a climate change denier at a science convention. He talked about reasonable doubt, about the burden of proof, about the dangers of convicting a man based on circumstantial evidence and emotional testimony. But you could see he didn't believe a word of it himself. His heart wasn't in it because his head had already accepted that his client was guilty as hell and headed for a life sentence. Judge Harrison's instructions to the jury were textbook perfect, explaining their duty, outlining the charges, reminding them about the standard of proof required for a conviction. But his tone made it clear that he expected them to come back with a guilty verdict, probably sometime before lunch if they didn't waste too much time on unnecessary deliberation. That's when he asked the question that every defendant dreads and every prosecutor loves. Mr. Cain, before this court proceeds to jury deliberation, do you have any final words you'd like to share with the court? This was my moment. The last chance to make my case, to protest my innocence, to beg for mercy or understanding or some kind of consideration from 12 people who'd already made up their minds that I was a cold-blooded killer. Every defendant in the history of American jurisprudence had used this opportunity to make one final plea for their freedom, their life, their chance to prove their innocence. Instead, I did something that nobody in that courtroom was expecting. I reached into the folder my lawyer had placed in front of me, the same folder he'd been using to take notes throughout the trial, the same folder that contained copies of all the evidence the prosecution had presented against me. But tucked inside that folder, invisible to everyone except me, was a single manila envelope, sealed, unmarked, containing information that was going to turn this entire proceeding upside down and inside out. I didn't say a word, didn't stand up, didn't address the jury, didn't make any kind of speech about my innocence or my service to my country or the injustice of what was happening to me. I simply slid that envelope across the table to Judge Harrison and waited. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the air conditioning humming overhead, someone's stomach growling in the gallery. Everyone was staring at me, trying to figure out what the hell I was doing. Marissa's eyes had gone wide with something that might have been confusion or might have been the first hint of real fear she'd shown since this whole thing started. Judge Harrison looked at the envelope like it might contain anthrax or a bomb or some other unpleasant surprise. His expression suggested that he was really not in the mood for whatever dramatic revelation I thought I was about to spring on his courtroom. But judicial procedure demanded that he open it. So he picked up his letter opener and slit the seal with the resigned air of a man who just wanted to get through the rest of his day without any more complications. He unfolded the papers inside, started reading, and then something very interesting happened to his face. The blood drained out of it like someone had pulled a plug. His eyes went wide, then narrow, then wide again as he scanned the documents. His hands actually started shaking as he turned to the second page, then the third, then back to the first like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The courtroom watched this transformation with growing unease. Marissa was gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table hard enough to leave marks. Patrick Morrison had gone pale in the gallery, his businessman's composure cracking around the edges. Even the bailiff was starting to look nervous, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Judge Harrison looked up from the papers, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he looked at Marissa, at Patrick, at the jury, at the packed gallery full of people who'd come to watch a monster get his comeuppance. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Something that suggested the nice, orderly trial they'd all been enjoying was about to take a hard left turn into territory nobody had been expecting. "Bailiff," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "Lock the doors. No one leaves this courtroom." The bailiff hesitated for just a second, clearly confused by the unprecedented order. But judges don't make requests like that lightly, and the tone in Harrison's voice suggested that this wasn't the time for questions or hesitation. The sound of the locks engaging echoed through the courtroom like gunshots. Suddenly, the comfortable theater of American justice had transformed into something else entirely. Something that felt more like a trap that had just snapped shut around everyone inside. Marissa was no longer the grieving widow seeking justice for her murdered father. She was a woman who'd just realized that her carefully constructed house of lies might be about to collapse around her ears. And me? I was still sitting quietly at the defendant's table, my hands folded in my lap, waiting to see what would happen when 10 days of lies finally met 30 seconds of truth. You know that moment in action movies when the cavalry shows up at exactly the right time, riding over the hill with flags flying and trumpets blaring? Yeah, this wasn't that. This was better. This was surgical precision delivered by people who understood that the best operations are the ones nobody sees coming until it's already over and the bodies are being counted. The back doors of the courtroom didn't burst open so much as they simply opened, quiet as a whisper, professional as a tax audit. No dramatic entrance, no movie-style theatrics. Just 5 men in plain suits walking in like they belonged there, like they'd been invited to this particular party and were only slightly late because of traffic. The kind of men who looked unremarkable until you noticed the way they moved, the way their eyes cataloged every face in the room, the way their hands stayed loose and ready at their sides. I recognized the lead man immediately. Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI, but the kind of FBI that didn't advertise their presence on business cards or government websites. The kind that handled situations too sensitive for regular law enforcement, too complicated for standard procedure, too dangerous for anyone who wasn't trained to operate in the gray areas where official policy met operational necessity. We'd worked together before, in places that didn't exist and on missions that never happened. Webb's eyes found mine across the courtroom, and I saw the faintest hint of a nod. Not acknowledgement exactly, more like confirmation, like he was letting me know that the favor I'd called in had been received, processed, and was now being executed with the kind of efficiency that made the American intelligence community the envy of dictators and terrorists worldwide. Judge Harrison was still staring at the papers in the envelope, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine that couldn't decide which jackpot to pay out. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and what looked suspiciously like the kind of fear that comes from realizing you've been sitting in a courtroom full of lies for 10 days without knowing it. "Your Honor," Webb said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud to be heard in every corner of the room. "Agent Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I apologize for the interruption, but we have some urgent business to conduct." Marissa had gone completely still at the plaintiff's table, like a deer that's just spotted the headlights bearing down on it. Her performance mask had finally slipped, revealing something underneath that looked a lot more like genuine terror than the grief she'd been selling for the past week and a half. Her eyes were darting between Webb and his team, between the locked doors and the envelope still clutched in Judge Harrison's shaking hands. Patrick Morrison was trying to stand up in the gallery, probably thinking he could bluff his way out of whatever was about to happen. That's what civilian criminals always think, that they can talk their way out of trouble, charm their way past consequences, lawyer their way around inconvenient facts. It's almost adorable, in the same way that a house cat thinking it can take on a mountain lion is adorable. "Excuse me," Patrick said, his voice carrying that entitled tone that rich men use when they think their money makes them untouchable. "But this is highly irregular. I demand to know what authority you have to." Webb cut him off with a look that could have stopped a charging rhino. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need you to sit down and remain quiet. You'll have plenty of opportunities to talk very soon." The threat in those words wasn't subtle. It was the kind of promise that came with federal backing and the full weight of resources that could make people disappear into the American justice system for decades at a time. Patrick sat down so fast you'd have thought his legs had been cut out from under him. Judge Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out about an octave higher than his usual courtroom baritone. "Agent Webb, what exactly is going on here? What's in this envelope?" "Evidence, Your Honor. The kind of evidence that tends to change the entire nature of a case." Webb gestured to one of his team, a woman who looked like she could bench press a small car and probably had at some point in her career. "Agent Martinez here has been conducting a parallel investigation into the death of Harold Brennan. Turns out there were some discrepancies in the official police report that warranted federal attention." Agent Martinez stepped forward, pulling out a tablet that probably contained more classified information than most small countries had access to. Her voice was crisp, professional, completely devoid of the emotion that had been driving this trial for the past 10 days. "Your Honor, we have surveillance footage from multiple sources showing Mrs. Kane's vehicle at the victim's residence on 3 separate occasions during the time frame when Mr. Brennan was killed. We also have phone records indicating coordination between Mrs. Kane and Mr. Morrison, including several calls made immediately before and after the victim's death." The jury was starting to look like they'd been hit with a collective stun gun. These were the same 12 people who'd been convinced beyond reasonable doubt that David Kane was a cold-blooded killer, and now they were being told that maybe, just maybe, they'd been watching the wrong movie for the past week and a half. Marissa finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "This is insane. I don't know what kind of conspiracy you're trying to construct here, but my husband killed my father. Jordan saw it happen. I saw the aftermath. This is all some kind of elaborate cover-up to protect a military." "Ma'am," Webb interrupted, and his tone suggested that he'd heard enough bullshit for one afternoon. "I'm going to stop you right there, because in about 30 seconds, you're going to be placed under arrest, and anything you say from this point forward is going to be used against you in federal court." He nodded to Agent Martinez, who began reading from her tablet with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from delivering bad news to bad people on a regular basis. "We have financial records showing large payments from Mr. Morrison to several individuals with extensive criminal records, payments that coincide exactly with the timeline of Mr. Brennan's death. We have testimony from one of those individuals detailing his role in staging the crime scene to implicate Mr. Kane." The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 20 degrees. Marissa was shaking now, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence that was dismantling her entire story piece by piece. Patrick Morrison looked like he was having some kind of cardiac episode, his face cycling through shades of red and purple that probably weren't medically advisable. "Furthermore," Martinez continued, "we have evidence that Mrs. Kane systematically manipulated her son's testimony through a process of psychological conditioning that amounts to child abuse under federal statutes. The boy's statement was not based on actual memory, but on implanted false recollections created through months of careful manipulation." Jordan looked confused, scared, like he was finally starting to understand that something was very wrong with the story he'd been telling. The kid was 12, not stupid, and you could see the gears turning in his head as he tried to process the idea that his mother had been lying to him, using him, turning him into a weapon against his own father. That's when Marissa made her last, desperate play. She lunged toward Jordan, probably thinking she could use him as some kind of human shield or emotional leverage. Jordan, baby, don't listen to them. They're lying. Daddy hurt Grandpa Harold, remember? We saw it together, remember? She never made it within 3 feet of him. Agent Martinez moved with the kind of fluid efficiency that comes from years of tactical training, intercepting Marissa's desperate grab and putting her on the ground in about 2 seconds flat. Professional, controlled, completely without drama or unnecessary violence. Marissa Kane, Martinez said, pulling out handcuffs that looked like they'd seen plenty of use. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, perjury, obstruction of justice, and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent, though frankly, that would be the smartest thing you've done in months. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music I'd heard in my entire life. Better than any symphony, any rock concert, any victory song that had ever been written. It was the sound of justice finally catching up with someone who'd thought they were clever enough to outsmart the system. Patrick Morrison was trying to blend into the gallery seating like a chameleon with commitment issues, but Webb was already moving in his direction with the patient, methodical approach of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. Mr. Morrison, Webb said conversationally, we also have some questions for you. Seems like your financial records show some very interesting patterns over the past few months. Large cash withdrawals, payments to individuals with interesting skill sets, wire transfers to offshore accounts. The kind of activity that makes federal investigators very curious about your business practices. Patrick tried to run. Actually tried to make a break for the doors like this was some kind of action movie, and he was the plucky protagonist who was going to escape at the last minute through a combination of luck and determination. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. He made it about 6 steps before one of Webb's team, a guy who looked like he could probably tackle a freight train and win. Put him down with the kind of textbook takedown they probably show in training videos at Quantico. Professional, efficient, completely unnecessary for anyone watching to worry about excessive force complaints. Patrick Morrison, the agent said, pulling Morrison's face off the courtroom floor and reaching for his own set of handcuffs. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and about 15 different financial crimes that are going to keep federal prosecutors busy for the next several years. The courtroom had gone dead silent except for the sound of Marissa sobbing and Patrick Morrison's muffled protests about lawyers and constitutional rights, and how this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Judge Harrison was still clutching the envelope like it contained the secrets of the universe, his eyes moving between the federal agents and the 2 people who'd just been arrested in his courtroom. Jordan was crying now, but not the fake tears his mother had taught him to produce on command. These were real tears, the kind that come from a 12-year-old boy finally understanding that everything he believed about his family, his father, his entire world, had been built on lies that were now crumbling around him. And me? I was still sitting at the defendant's table, watching my wife and her lover get arrested for the murder they'd tried to pin on me, feeling something that was part relief, part satisfaction, and part anger that it had taken this long for the truth to finally surface. Webb walked over to my table, his expression neutral, but his eyes showing just a hint of the satisfaction that comes from a job well done. Sorry it took so long, Kane. Had to make sure we had everything buttoned up tight before we moved. Couldn't risk any of this falling apart on technicalities. I nodded, understanding completely. When you're taking down a conspiracy this elaborate, you don't get second chances. You get everything right the first time, or you watch the bad guys walk away to try again with someone else. Appreciate the assist, I said quietly. I owe you one. Webb smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him since he walked into the courtroom. Actually, Kane, I think we're even now. Maybe even a little ahead. Judge Harrison dismissed my case in 43 seconds flat. I know because I counted, watching the second hand on the courtroom clock tick away the final moments of the biggest clusterfuck of my professional life. 43 seconds to undo 10 days of lies, manipulation, and character assassination. 43 seconds to transform me from convicted murderer back to decorated soldier with a really shitty taste in women. The gavel came down like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish reading. All charges dismissed, Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd just learned that his courtroom had been turned into a stage for an elaborate con game. "Mr. Kane, you're free to go, and the court apologizes for this miscarriage of justice." An apology? Like that was supposed to make up for 10 days in county lockup and the rest of my life knowing that my own son had been programmed to believe I was a murderer. The social workers moved fast after that, swooping in with their clipboards and their concerned expressions and their theories about child psychology. They wanted to reunite me with Jordan, kept talking about healing the family unit and rebuilding trust, like this was some kind of fucking Hallmark movie where everything gets tied up with a neat little bow in the final 5 minutes. But I knew better. I'd seen the look in my son's eyes when Marcus had explained how his memories had been manipulated, when he'd realized that everything he thought he remembered about that night was just software his mother had installed in his 12-year-old brain. That kind of betrayal doesn't heal with family counseling and awkward weekend visits. "He'll come around," the social worker insisted, clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. "Children are resilient. With time and proper therapy." I declined, politely but firmly. Because some things can't be fixed, and some relationships can't survive that kind of fundamental violation of trust. Jordan would spend years trying to separate his real memories from the false ones Marissa had implanted. The last thing he needed was the constant reminder that his testimony had almost destroyed his father's life. Maybe someday, when he was older, when he'd processed what had been done to him, we could try again. But not now. Not when every time he looked at me, he'd remember the father he'd been taught to fear. That night, I returned to an empty house that felt like a museum dedicated to a life that had never really existed. Marissa's coffee mug was still in the sink. Jordan's homework was scattered across the kitchen table. The family photos on the mantel showed 3 people who'd never actually been a family, just actors playing roles they'd never fully understood. I stood in the doorway of Jordan's room for a long time, looking at the action figures and the unmade bed and the poster of some superhero whose powers included always doing the right thing. 12 years old, and he'd already learned that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who'll hurt you deepest. The silence in that house was absolute. No Marissa humming off-key in the kitchen. No Jordan's video games bleeping from the living room. No sounds of normal family life that had always been more performance than reality anyway. People think revenge is loud. They think it's about explosions and dramatic confrontations and speeches about justice being served. But real revenge? Real revenge is the sound of a door locking behind someone who thought they'd already escaped. It's the quiet satisfaction of watching a carefully constructed lie collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Marissa and Patrick were looking at serious federal time. The kind of sentences that would keep them busy until their hair turned gray and their joints started creaking. Jordan was safe, in therapy, learning to trust his own memories again. And me? I was free, vindicated, and completely alone in a house that had never really been a home. Silence filled every corner, but it no longer felt foreign. It felt like truth.